for entertainment purposes only. And if you want true legal advice, contact your own lawyer.
You're listening to RadioLawTalk.com. And now back to your host, Frederick Penney.
Let's dive right into it. Miss Wolf is one of the individuals that is testifying against Harvey Weinstein as showing prior bad acts. She is not one of the people alleging or in the complaint for sexual assault, but she testified, I believe this past week. I can't remember if it was Friday or Thursday, but she's talking about him taking her up to the apartment, going up to the apartment. Actually went to this a terrace of some sort out the back. Where was her first interaction with him?
She was a cocktail waitress at a place, and he came in, always sat at the owner's table, and he had taken her up to the terrace. And this is the first incident. Took her up to the terrace. We don't want to get descriptive about what he did. Let's just say that he didn't touch her up on top of the terrace. I mean, he held her by the arm and led her there. But once they got to the terrace, he turned around and, I will say, engaged in an activity by himself that would have constituted indecent exposure, lewd act in public in any jurisdiction. She threw a towel at him and left. Right. That's the first interaction.
But now here's the issue when they cross-examine her, saying, then on a later occasion, she's brought by an individual, apparently maybe an assistant of Weinstein, or I don't know. Again, these are all allegations that says, come meet him at his New York apartment, and she goes. And she, at that point, things occur that she does without her consent, and she didn't call the police, obviously on cross-examination. That's what they're arguing is, why didn't you call the police? Why did you allow a stranger to take you to this individual's apartment when you knew what he had done before was kind of a lewd act that you complained about? And that's actually what they cross-examine her on. And those are good, legitimate questions.
Exactly. And look, one of the things that the defense is trying to do here, and that they always try to do in cases, the defense attorney always has to have their mind towards, worst case scenario, we lose, are there issues that we can file an appeal on? Now, the introduction of prior acts evidence, common motive and scheme, these four witnesses that we've been talking about, can be perilous and detrimental to the prosecution's case if on appeal the defense can argue that those witnesses were improperly admitted and that they so tainted the jury pool that the jury ultimately convicted because of what happened to the corroborating witnesses and not necessarily on what happened to the named victims. And what the defense is going to try to do is to show that the accounts given by each corroborating witness are so different and so disparate and not like each other that it was error to admit them under a, quote, common plan or motive scheme, because they didn't occur in the same way. And if they can do that and they lose, then the argument to the appellate court is the evidence was prejudicial, shouldn't have been brought in.
Yeah, those of you who are first joining us, Todd Cunin is a former prosecutor in Tennessee and in California, and now a defense lawyer. I'm a personal injury lawyer, and Denise does family law. So kind of and Cal plays a lawyer on TV. So,
that's right.
Or at least at his house he does.
In my dreams.
It feels like they're trying to get the common theme that Weinstein initiates the contact, that Weinstein uses his power and contracts and ability to get readings for these people as some kind of a offer to get them to go with him, and that Weinstein just says to people, though, this is just part of the business.
Yeah, but what's interesting is the most important part is, by the way, it's a woman that's cross-examining her, that's on Weinstein's team, says, by the way, you never said these stories before when you talked to the prosecutors and or the press before. You had a different. She didn't fill it all in. And
about the prior
occurrence. And what the interesting thing is, then that kind of a little bit of a bombshell. And by the way, didn't they send you to a memory doctor?
Yeah.
And there's objection about using the word memory doctor, but that's basically what it is. We're going to help you remember things. And boy, to me, that's kind of a stab.
Yeah, we talked a couple months ago about the fight that Weinstein and the prosecution was having over their experts, and one of them was a memory expert.
Cal, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to be clear, just because a lot of folks who are just tuning in for the first time go, sexual assault is sexual activity or sexual contact or conduct that is unwelcome on the other person in this group. Is that correct?
Generally speaking,
generally
yes.
speaking.
Yeah, I mean, is that about right, Todd?
Yeah, that's a very broad-based way to describe it. Accurate, yes.
That's right. Okay, don't forget 855-LAW-RADIO or 855-529-7234 if you want to join in.
And again, this witness here is one of those where the defense is trying to show her account differs from others. With others, it was an individual that had arguably no prior inclination that Weinstein would engage in this kind of activity, showed up to talk to him about an acting role or something, and then this activity is sprung on them. Well, in Wolf's case, you had the prior incident that occurred on the terrace. There's no evidence in anything we've read where they even discussed acting at that point. And then she goes to him at a private location, whether brought to him or whatever, but she goes there knowing that this other incident had previously occurred. And so that is different than the way it happened with other people. And then the other inconsistency where they said, how come you didn't tell this to prosecutors? It's one thing if a witness doesn't tell anybody because they're scared and they don't say anything, but when prosecutors are interviewing you and you've had a sufficient amount of time or a period of time from the incident to the time the prosecutors are meeting with you about this case, and your story changes from that interview to what you said on the stand, that is big.
Yes,
especially if in the intervening time they sent you to somebody
memory doctor
to help you remember something.
Here's the other thing. So don't forget, a lot of this is happening around 2004. We're going to jump forward to 2013, where Jessica Mann is going to testify. She's one of the named victims, and all the stuff that we've been hearing about is basically prior bad acts. Now we're going to jump to the actual witnesses. They're going to testify that in 2013 this occurred, which was within the statute of limitations.
What does Todd's cat say? Oh, that's down.
Radio Law Talk. Now back to the show.
So we're talking about the Weinstein case, and one of this great famous Sopranos actress is testifying, and what they do is they bring in people that testify of prior bad acts, and she's one of the witnesses of the bad acts.
Yes, so none of her testimony is going toward, and I may have misspoken when I was setting this up earlier, none of her testimony is going to the actual events that Weinstein is charged with.
Right.
This is to come in. Normally in a case, you're not allowed to bring in prior bad actions to say, well, if he did it then, he probably did it now, right? If you do a DUI trial, the jury doesn't hear about the defendant's prior DUIs, if they're alleged, until after they have determined whether or not the person's guilty on this current DUI. Then afterwards, they can find out about it if they have to prove the priors, but so normally that doesn't come in unless the prosecution can say, look, this guy's got a pattern. He's predatory. He does this and this and this, and he does it all the time. And that's what these four people, and yesterday and this week was the first, are testifying to about what he does and how he does it. And as Fred said, we're not going to get into the specifics. We'll just say generally what she's alleging is that in late 93, early 94, and the defense hammered on the fact that she couldn't be specific as to the date, that she had gone to an industry dinner with Weinstein. Weinstein gave her a ride home. And when he gave her the ride home, he forced his way into her apartment.
This is the allegation.
This is the allegation. Forced his way into her apartment and sexually assaulted her.
Yeah. So we can get on a few details that he was forcing himself and pushing her down, and she said she was punching him and kicking him to get off. He forced her to do some things, and she basically, at a point, she says, my body just shut down, and I just, just gave in, and and I just didn't, and that's kind of her mantra. This is what she said.
That's what she said. And look, the defense is going to point out, and they did a little bit in some of the cross-examination. The defense is going to point out, one, though Harvey Weinstein, though there is a size disparity, defense is going to point out that your allegation is with one hand he held your two hands over your head and then was able to do everything else, disrobe himself and engage in all of that conduct, but with one hand he held your hands over your head. That's going to be open to interpretation as to whether or not he could have accomplished that with just the one hand.
And this is the cross-examination of Weinstein's lawyer, who was a woman.
Yes.
Bringing this across to her. Now let's make sure. There's 8 separate things. I'm not trying to interrupt you.
Sure. Go ahead.
Let's make sure we hit all 8. So the first one they argue is you don't remember the date. Not only the month, you might not even remember the year. Sometime in 93, 94, late 93, early 94.
And she tried to come back and say, no. I remember it was late 93, early 94. Which kind of proves the point is, but you can't mention the specific date.
Right.
Which let me tell you something. This is why that's big.
Right.
Because if you had gone to an industry function in 93, 94, it ought to be pretty easy if you can remember the function that you went to go back and find out what date it was.
Yes, and by the way, we're going to lay out, again, these are allegations back at her, but there's going to be a psychiatrist that's going to testify. We're going to talk about in a minute. But here's important. The second thing she couldn't remember is the address of the building that she lived at.
Yeah.
She didn't remember that.
Which would be very easy to get in a credit report.
So that's another thing. And then also they argue, you were drinking a lot, weren't you, that night? And she said, no, I had one glass of wine. And this is on the cross-examination. They also said, isn't it true you sued your landlord? Your landlord sued you for $360,000. Don't forget, this is all going to her veracity,
yes,
or her ability to tell the truth or remember things. And again, this is just going to Weinstein also, what type of person he is. So they bring up this landlord issue where the landlord sued her for $360,000 in major damage that she caused to this landlord's home, and they're arguing that she concealed this in this lawsuit. I mean, concealed this damage apparently to the landlord.
Yes, but she did admit, she conceded there that, yes, this happened. On the drinking thing, the issue they also brought up, because she was trying to say, I only had one glass of wine, and they said, well, weren't you on a film where your drinking was also brought up as an issue in your performance on the film? And that had to come up too. Right. The next area where they get to, the next area that the defense gets to is how she reacted immediately following this claim that she was raped by Weinstein. And this is where the defense really needs to be careful.
That's exactly right, because they actually have experts, the prosecutor does, coming in testifying what happens to rape victims and how they react. Because,
exactly.
First of all, they all react differently, and just because you don't act like a normal, quote, normal person would act is not necessarily mean that you were not raped.
You've heard me say, I said this last week, and I've said this all the time as a prosecutor for 3 years when I was prosecuting these cases, and this isn't the type of case that I will handle as a defense attorney. But there are as many different ways for somebody to react to being raped or being a victim of sexual assault as there are victims of sexual assault. There is no normal.
Right, that's exactly right. So here's the cross-examination.
Yes.
We're still in the cross-examination. Quote, when you woke up, did you go to the police?
No.
Her answer is no. And next question, when you woke up, did you go to the doctor?
No.
When you woke up, did you go to the hospital?
No.
And here's another interesting thing. At the time, okay, let's back, well, there's a couple of things. And she basically said, I just went through my life and pretended it never happened because I wanted to get back to my life. I resumed my life to the best of my ability. That's her argument. Remember also, by the way, we got to put ourselves back in that time period. Weinstein was a very powerful producer. And I'm not, again, we're staying neutral, but you've got to take all this into consideration. Does she go out and say something about it or not? Also, because she said she didn't call the police because he was someone I knew, and she actually thought kindly of him and that he was a good person. And this kind of threw her for a loop. Now, here's the other interesting thing. And then she argues at another event, he tries to kind of make some passes at her too. And at the time, she was good friends with apparently Sylvester Stallone. And
she was in the movie Copland with Stallone.
Stallone and who's it?
Bob De Niro.
De Niro, yeah, yes. Robert De Niro. And they said, why didn't you go to Stallone and De Niro? I mean, they're there. They're your friends. Why don't you go to them and say, I have an issue here. Why? Please help me with Harvey. And she basically said, well, I didn't. But then, we're going to get into this in a little bit, but about the psyche of a person who's been raped or been molested.
There was one other thing that she said here when asked, because she was asked about whether or not she felt that she had been raped at the time. And initially she said no, that she did not feel like she had been raped. And her quote was, I would say at the time that I felt rape was something that happened in a back alley in a dark place by somebody you didn't know, right, holding a gun to your head. Now, I don't know if the defense is going to raise this or not, but that's an interesting thing to say about an incident in 93 and 94, because if you remember, there was a very, very high-profile sexual assault case. It was one of the first ones that was on TV. It was the William Kennedy Smith trial that happened down at Ted Kennedy's compound in Florida.
Right.
And that was all about a date gone wrong. It was very similar to all this. And I think the defense would maybe counter, well, wait a second, that might be true in 83 or 84, but by 93 or 94, there's a lot of public information and a lot of publicity about this kind of conduct that happened because of William Kennedy Smith, and that might cut against the idea that she thought it was this type of conduct. However, you can never get in somebody's mind and tell them what they are or not thinking, can you?
Yeah, no. So there's all this. The thing you always have to be careful of in these type of cases is hindsight's 20/20.
Yes.
She should have done this. She should have done that. And again, this is back early on when it was a little bit different. I hate to say it. There was not the Me Too movement, and she was probably scared of what he could have done.
That is Armadillo.
Radio Law Talk. Now back to the show.
So Barbara Ziv is is an expert in psychology dealing with rape victims, and she is on the stand testifying on behalf of the prosecutors as to what typical rape victims, and everyone's different, go through. And this is very interesting to read because this kind of follows in line what the witnesses are saying also. She first says that there's myths. Number one, and there's an incorrect belief that most rapes are committed by strangers of the victims, and that they generally resist their assailants. That's a myth, she testifies. And by the way, how is this individual psychologist known so well for? She testified for the prosecution in the Cosby case. She said also the vast majority of sexual assault victims don't promptly report what happened to them. Usually they don't always reveal their claim or remember exact details of the incident. And a lot of people, she states, believe that are victims of assault, that they can put this behind them and try to move on. As devastating as it is, they're going to just try to move on. I could see that also, especially if you're, this is back in the 80s, 90s, and there's a powerful person that's in the industry that you don't want to affect your acting
when you think
jobs.
You have no recourse.
Right.
What else can you do?
Right. But the other, and the reason they're doing this too, by the way, defense is just starting. There's all types of friendly and even loving messages back and forth between the defendant the defendant in this case and the person that's claiming that they were assaulted. Again, I can't remember the Sopranos lady we just talked about. She's just a corroborating. She's not. This is not about her. It's about this other individual.
You know, one thing to keep in mind is that when people face a traumatic incident, regardless of what it is, there are one of two common ways that they respond. It's called fight or flight. And oftentimes, you don't know which one. You can say that you are one or the other. You don't really know which one you are until you find yourself in a situation where your response is one of those two type responses. And look, if you've gone to dinner and the person has walked you to your door and you're done and they're an industry professional and you think that they're really great, and then all of a sudden this is happening to you, I think it's perfectly reasonable that maybe the flight, or I would say the paralyzed, your mind goes somewhere else response would kick in. You can't say that that's not normal. There is no normal, but not all people are going to fight.
Yeah, no, and they all act differently.
Yes.
And so one of obviously the big argument of you didn't go to the police, you didn't call anyone, you didn't call Stallone, you didn't say to De Niro, you didn't talk to anyone, you didn't go to the doctor, but this expert is testifying is going to say, or basically said that that's not unusual, that they don't do that. Now, there's going to be battling experts. There's going to be experts you watch on the defense side. They're going to come up and say the opposite.
Seems like being a victim of a mass shooting, and the hotel attorney says, well, how come you didn't run? How come you didn't hide?
Yeah.
How come you didn't do this? How come you're just second-guessing behavior that's not second-guessable? I don't.
Right. So anyway, we're going to move on from that because we got a million things to talk about. But they also cross-examined this expert. That's the defense of Harvey Weinstein, saying she's a blind expert. What's a blind expert? A blind expert is one basically that's not going to talk about this case. They're just talking about generalities, and they go into how much money the state has paid her, and quite a bit of money to come in and testify. So that's coming up. Then the final witness is, and we're not going to get into detail of this, is a former board member of Harvey's in his company who, this is one I you take this with a grain of salt. They didn't like each other. One person took another person's job. You took a movie that I should have had, type of thing. And they separate ways. Of course, he's got a bone to pick. I don't know that I put a lot of credence into that. Who knows what's going to happen? But another interesting thing, though, is about something I didn't know is the prosecution. What is their decision to show jurors a photo of the Weinstein with former President Bill Clinton in their opening statement, and they said you should throw this whole case out. That's something I didn't know, but they're trying to say, hey, that's skewing it also. So
go to the website radiolawtalk.com. That's radiolawtalk.com.